Welcome to the Explore podcast, brought to you by Canadian Geographic. Here's some good news. Geographica is back. The annual RCGS Fellows Dinner is being held in person at the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa on Wednesday, November 6th. Guest speakers will include the RCGS team that found the wreck of Quest, the last ship of the legendary explorer Ernest Shackleton. To buy tickets, go to rcgs.org, where you can also take part in the silent auction. It's a lot of fun and for a great cause.
It's not something that you want to just open up and, it's pretty secretive stuff when you were born in a mission school and thrown away.
Well, for something that important to our literal existence, I think I want to know the whole story.
It's kind of like it just keeps on damaging, just keeps on going.
That's Julian Brave NoiseCat with his father, Ed Archie NoiseCat, from Julian's award-winning documentary, Sugarcane. It tells the story of the St. Joseph's Mission Indian Residential School in British Columbia and the very real intergenerational damage it had on Julian's family and members of the nearby Williams Lake First Nation. Welcome to this National Day of Truth and Reconciliation edition of Explore, the Canadian Geographic podcast. I'm David McGuffin. I'm really thrilled to welcome Julian Brave NoiseCat to the podcast. He is a contributing editor here at Canadian Geographic who has written a number of smart, thoughtful articles in the magazine over the years. His documentary, Sugarcane, recently won him and his colleague, Emily Kassie, the Director's Award at the Sundance Film Festival. Sugarcane is a powerful exposition of the brutality and abuse carried out against First Nations children at St. Joseph's Mission, set against the backdrop of the discovery of mass unmarked graves at residential schools right across Canada in 2021. Sugarcane turns decades of rumors into facts about the abuse and murder of First Nations children and babies at St. Joseph's. And before we get to our conversation, a trigger warning. This interview does feature discussions of the physical and sexual abuse of children and may not be appropriate for all listeners. Julian Brave NoiseCat, thanks so much for coming on the Explore podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back talking to Can Geo.
I want to say congratulations on the movie. It's incredibly powerful, very personal movie for you. And I'm glad to see it's getting the recognition it deserves too, with Director's Award at Sundance for you and your co-director.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been incredible to bring it around the world and to see it received by critics, juries, audiences in the way that it has. There's no greater feeling as a filmmaker.
I'm interested. You're in the UK right now, promoting it there. Obviously, the residential school story is something Canadians are much more familiar with, especially in the last decade, I would say. I'm just wondering what the reception is like there.
It all started here, I guess. It's all because this society was obsessed with spices and sugar and tea and land, I guess. But no, in all seriousness, it's very encouraging to see the way that people relate this story to their own experiences and their own issues. Obviously, this is a story about a particular place and a particular history. It's set on the Sugarcane Indian Reserve, predominantly in British Columbia, as well as nearby St. Joseph's Mission and the unfolding of that history and legacy. But it's also a Canadian story. It's a North American story because there were schools just like this in the United States. And then, these issues of, the abuses of the Catholic Church, as well as questions of colonialism and imperialism and their legacies, these are global issues in lots of ways. And, they're definitely things that audiences here in the United Kingdom are also thinking about and resonating with.
So obviously this is a very personal story. It involves your family directly and St. Joseph Mission. For people who aren't familiar with St. Joseph Mission, can you just sort of give us a synopsis of what that place was?
Sure. So St. Joseph's Mission was one of 139 federally funded Indian residential schools that operated across Canada from about the 1880s to the 1990s. St. Joseph's Mission began actually just as a Catholic school that was educating settlers in the region, but then when the Canadian government started funding Indian residential schools after an amendment to the Indian Act that made those schools compulsory for all Native children, it converted essentially into a segregated Indian residential school, one just like the ones that people have been hearing about in national news across the country. It operated until 1981, and there is an ongoing investigation at that school into potential unmarked graves, into missing children, into abuse, as well as into a more troubling story that has gone so far unreported until our documentary about what happened to the babies that were born at that residential school.
That brings us to the story of your father and your grandmother, obviously, as well. I mean, what was happening to the babies?
You know, there was this enduring question that my father in particular had, but I also shared about what happened to him when he was born, because there was sort of a black box in that part of his life. He had heard stories of being born at St. Joseph's Mission or just in Williams Lake, and that he had been found in a trash can or a dumpster there. But he didn't really know the specifics of that story. He actually wasn't even sure and didn't know that he was born at the residential school. And what's really crazy about all this, at least to me, is that, you know, when I was younger, I had heard these stories about babies being born at St. Joseph's Mission and then being put in the school's incinerator. And at the time when I'd heard that story, you know, I'd assumed that it was something like a ghost story, you know, that it was little more than a res legend. I myself did not even really believe it. And little did I know that this story about what I think could accurately be described as a pattern of infanticide at St. Joseph's Mission, you know, was not just true, but it was also part of my own lineage, that this is actually how my father entered this world. And so the film, you know, follows multiple narrative threads, but one of them is our family story, and that's the story of my father and I trying to find out the story around and about his birth, and then also, you know, trying to sort out intergenerationally, you know, how we might not just find answers, but also, you know, reconciliation, because of course, you know, that trauma rippled out across generations, as it did in many other Indigenous families, and, you know, the healing that we also need is inherently also going to be intergenerational. And you know, for the making of the documentary, I actually moved in with my dad, despite the fact that, you know, I hadn't lived with him since I was a small child. You know, he left when I was a little boy, and you know, we really didn't see each other much after that. But during the making of this film, we lived together, and then we went on this amazing road trip that's in the documentary back to the residential school and the res to look for answers and to find some measure of healing.
There's definitely several threads to the documentary, but one of them is, and the really powerful one, is you and your father. And how difficult was it to make that decision to tell that story? I mean, it's such a painful story, but to do it in such a public way. And I'm just wondering how hard it was to convince your dad.
Well, you know, it was actually hard for both of us to be convinced to do it. When I agreed to work on the documentary, firstly, you know, my colleague and co-director, Emily Kassie, who I worked with at my first reporting job at the Huffington Post, reached out to me the day of the discovery of 215 potential unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, a discovery that your listeners are likely familiar with, that, you know, made international headlines. After that discovery, she reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you be open to collaborating with me on a documentary about Indian residential schools?" And at the time, I had just signed a book contract, and I had never written a book, and I'd never made a documentary or a film, so doing both at the same time felt a bit foolish. But more to the point, you know, I knew that my family had a very traumatic connection to the Indian residential schools. I didn't know the specifics of that story, But, I knew that there was a story there, and I didn't know if I was ready to touch that in any medium, let alone a medium that I'd never worked in before. And so I told her that I would take a couple weeks to think about it. And in that time, she forged ahead. She's an incredible award-winning investigative multimedia journalist, and she found a First Nation that was going to begin a search at a nearby residential school. And she cold emailed the chief of that First Nation, whose name was Willie Sellers. And when she emailed Willie the next day, Willie called back and he said, the creator has always had good timing. Just yesterday, our chief and counsel had a meeting where we agreed that it was essential for the investigation at St. Joseph's Mission to be documented. So she booked her flights, and then a couple weeks later, she was headed to Williams Lake, and that's when I called her back. And when I called her back, she told me that she'd found a First Nation that was leading a search, and that search was happening at St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake, British Columbia. And when she said that, I was floored. Because, of course, out of the 139 Indian residential schools in Canada, that was the school that my family was sent to and where my father was born. And, so it was really sort of, I think, kind of fate that brought us together, and not something that I had, sought out to do on my own, and honestly not something that I probably would have sought out to do on my own. It was like this story, found them and then found us. And that made it something that ultimately I couldn't turn away from and put down, despite the fact that, to be honest with you, at many junctures, I really wanted to. It was an incredibly challenging personal thing that, not only weighed on me, but also weighed on my father, weighed on our family, weighed on my that's my grandmother. And, for the entire first year of filming, we didn't record anything, almost nothing about my story or my family's story. Of course, the agreement at the beginning was that Em and I, would be collaborators as co-directors behind the camera, not that I was going to be a participant. But as the story unfolded, it increasingly felt to me and to both of us like the only right way to do this, given what all the other participants in this documentary, including, elderly survivors of this school, were gifting us with their own traumatic stories, with their own bravery in confronting this history of a cultural genocide, that the only right way to go about that ultimately, especially when you happen to be the son of the only known survivor of the incinerator at St. Joseph's Mission, was to go there with your own story and your own family's story, to reciprocate the bravery of people who did not have directing roles in this film. And so that's what I ultimately chose to do, how we ultimately chose to approach it. And I think that it was the right decision, not just creatively, but also, in my life. And I think I will always be grateful that this is how I chose to live this moment of reckoning for my people and my family.
Yeah, I mean, I don't get into it too much, but I mean, the story arc of you and your father is a beautiful thing to come out of this, for sure. And it seems like there's a definite drawing together of the two of you, even if there isn't complete answers for everything in the end. That is a beautiful thing to watch.
I think it was really important for us to have a conversation about the intergenerational impacts of these institutions. I think that the beginning of this conversation, is of course what happened at these institutions. What did staff, priests, nuns, etc., what did they perpetrate against children and their families? But then a second part of this story, one that is a bit harder sometimes to get at and definitely harder to talk about, is what then happened in our own families as Native people, what happened in our own communities, what were the intergenerational impacts of these schools, how did that violence, that suffering, that colonialism, travel across time and generations. And, I think that that's kind of the core of my father and my Ka'a's narrative in this documentary. It's really getting at how, in this instance, a story of abandonment then rippled, down into my own life. And I think that that's a story that we need to have in many different ways as First Peoples, and that people need to understand about this because, to this day, Indigenous peoples are living with, the highest rates of suicide, of addiction. We are truly suffering. We are basically at the bottom of every social outcome metric in North America. And I think that you can, and many experts would agree that you can trace that reality back to policies like the residential schools that separated people from their families, that fundamentally broke down the things that create community and create wellness, the family structure. And in a way, I have to forgive, of course, have to forgive and have compassion for and love for my father and his mother and everybody else in this situation because, as First Peoples, we were not allowed to raise our own children. And so, of course, by the time it was, my dad's turn to be a dad, he didn't really know how to do that. And, I lived with that pain at the same time as, I have love for the person who left me in that situation.
The other person in this movie who really stood out to me was Chief Rick Gilbert. And I'm just wondering, how you came across his story and why you chose him as one of your central storytellers of this documentary.
Well, it actually wasn't me who identified the late Chief Rick Gilbert as one of the protagonists of this documentary. It was Emily. She showed up in Williams Lake about a week before I got there. And when I showed up, she was like, I think that these are our main characters. And she had identified my aunt, Charlene Bellew, who is an activist and one of the lead investigators of the search at St. Joseph's Mission. She identified Chief Willie Sellers, who's obviously the leader of the Williams Lake First Nation, as well as a family man who's, trying to raise his kids in, the wake of an institution that made such a thing impossible. And, of course, the late Chief Rick Gilbert, who had a very intense connection to the schools. Him and 3 generations of his family were taken away to and abused at St. Joseph's Mission. And Rick himself, and this comes out in the documentary, is the biological son of a priest at St. Joseph's Mission.
The principal, even, I think,
he looks. You'll see in the documentary, he looks it too. He really, looks like a priest out of, an Irish Catholic priest right out of Central Casting.
That face is very Irish. Yeah.
And I think that this was something that was known, but it was also something that he was teased about, and it was something that really haunted and humiliated him throughout his life. And, I think that it was really, I think that M's story instincts here, were to me kind of undeniable. It was a great idea, of course, to follow an investigation that gives you a clear narrative through line for a film like this. And also, when I showed up and I have my own, journalistic background, of course, as well. I ultimately agreed that, these were the right stories to follow. Of course, some part of me wanted to be like, no, let's follow this person or that person. But, it was kind of undeniable that when you had this cast of characters, an activist, a leader, and, an elder who remains faithful to the Catholic Church despite this history, that it's just incredibly compelling and gets at the complexity and, the depth of depravity, and well as the depth of resilience and just really the full breadth of the human experience that came out of these institutions and that persists despite them.
Yeah, no, that's the thing that really struck me, is that he is not just faithful to the Catholic Church, he's actively involved in his church locally. And you sort of wonder how you can do that. And it's and he then becomes part of the delegation that goes to the Vatican.
Well, I think it's so, it's so human, right? I think that's what also drew us to that contradiction. I mean, there are so many contradictions in this history. This is also a cow town on the Caribou Gold Rush Trail, where there are cowboys and Indians and Indian cowboys. And there are so many other parts of this that really get at the duality of, the human experience. And I think that the Catholicism is right at the core of that. What is so dark and complex and human about this story is that you have, these elders who are the survivors of these institutions, who were themselves abused by Catholic priests, by members of the clergy in many instances, who themselves remain faithful Catholics, who, in Rick's instance, he's a caretaker of the Catholic Church on the Sugarcane Indian Reserve. In my Kaz case, she is also still a faithful Catholic. She, in fact, sings the hymns in Secwepemchin in our native language, wow, despite the fact that it was, the residential school, the mission, as we call it, that, very nearly annihilated that same language. And I just think that that's so, human. There are no easy answers here. And, our attachment to religion, is sometimes how we get through. The reality is that, children who were abused at this school, one of the ways that they tried to and did survive that abuse, the way that they persisted was with a rosary in their hands. And, there's no changing that fact.
Yeah, and the duality you talk about, there's a lot of, there's a beautiful scene of you involved in a traditional dance competition. There's scenes of smudging. There's a lot of sort of First Nations traditional practices going on in this movie. And I'm wondering how important it was for you to get that in there, and just how important that is, you think, in the healing process for your family, for instance, even.
Well, this is a story that is essentially about spirituality, right? Like the Indian residential schools were many things, but one of them was a process of spiritual colonization. They were built to eliminate one form of belief and replace it with another. And, one of the ways that First Peoples have, tried to heal ourselves from this history is that we've returned to the beliefs, cultures, traditions, and languages that were imperiled by those institutions, that in some instances were very nearly annihilated. And, I think that's it's also an inherently very spiritual story. It deals in questions of ancestry in the past, in those who've in some instances gone on, and also in my dad's case, he entered this world right on the precipice of, whatever it is that lies beyond this world. And, I think that, our people in our artistic and narrative traditions, have always taken questions of the spirit, of spirituality, of the spirit world very seriously. And sometimes we give those things agency. We give them explanatory power in the events that unfold in this world. Usually journalism and documentary, they're very secular genres, but this film, it's not just in conversation with, a Western tradition of nonfiction. It has to be, of course, in conversation with an indigenous one, with a specifically Secwepemc and Salish and Statliunk one. And, so we took those things really seriously, and also, to be honest with you, we also felt them. Like, what is it that drew M to this story, that drew M to the one school that my family was sent to? How is it that like one of the only, storytellers and filmmakers from, this entire region of the world, is the son of the, one known survivor of, the babies born and found at St. Joseph's Mission. Some of these coincidences, do make you wonder whether, my ancestors had a point, whether these are the right ways sometimes to look at and tell these stories. And so it was really important throughout the film that we gave that its fair shake, we gave it its fair due, and that we represented the ways that people, are coming back from this history, which is sometimes with a complicated relationship to Catholicism, and now more often, with a return to tradition.
Just to go back to where this goes, there's one of the most powerful scenes in the movie is Rick Gilbert meeting with the head of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, which ran that school and ran, I think, 48 schools across the country, residential schools. He's quietly persistent in sort of making him listen to the story.
My grandmother, she was abused at the mission and she tried to run away. I was also abused by a priest at the residential school. And I kept that a secret for about 30 years after I left. And my mother was abused by a priest. And that's how I was born.
And he says at the end, when he gets an apology, he says, it's not, being sorry is just the first step. We need action. And I'm just curious about I know there's been a lot of talk about whether they're releasing documents that can help people understand better what happened in these schools and where that fight is now.
Well, I think that one of the interesting things about the Catholic Church, and this is very evident when you look at the Vatican in our documentary, is that, there is no shortage of wealth that this institution has. Yeah. If you go to the Vatican Museum, it's like they've run out of space to put all of their art. And, I think from an indigenous perspective, we might more accurately describe it as loot. Yeah. And, it's like, it's even on the ceilings, right? Like the whole place is just clad in, centuries upon centuries of artwork. And yet, as Rick points out in that conversation, there's so many remarkable things about that conversation, which is almost like a confession, honestly, that Rick has with the representative of the Catholic order that abused him and 3 generations of his family. But one of the more remarkable things that he says that often gets overlooked is, the Catholic Church has never paid its fair share. And it's true. If you look at the settlements that have gone to residential school survivors and in some instances their families, it's been the federal government that's been footing the bill, despite the fact that the Catholic Church, is an incredibly wealthy institution. It's the largest landowner, as far as I know, in the world. And I think that raises questions here about, what does the Catholic Church owe to, First Peoples? They operated the majority of schools in Canada. And I think that the first answer to all that, I think that there are many, many answers that are totally fair and legitimate here. The first answer to that is well, of course, the truth. I think that survivors and their families deserve a full accounting of what happened to them, and that would necessitate an opening up of the records that are, some of which are still held and not open by the Catholic Church. And then I think it would also necessitate, allowing First Peoples ourselves to be in the driver's seat to determine, what justice and accountability look like, because that might not take the form of, a lawsuit, a settlement, of reparations. It might take actually, more indigenous forms of justice, of ceremony and repair. And I think that we really need to be open to all of those possibilities. And I think we also need to grapple with the fact that, despite that the reality that this conversation, has been going on for a decade in Canada, we still, do not know a lot about these institutions. Like St. Joseph's Mission, there was a book, maybe arguably 2 books written about this school. There were court cases, criminal cases in the 1990s, and yet this documentary is the first to uncover and document pattern of infanticide, to tell the story about what happened to the babies who were born at this institution. And if you multiply that across, 138 other schools across Canada, across 417 federally funded schools in the United States, I gotta imagine that there is a whole heck of a lot of this story that remains unknown.
Absolutely. And those schools in the States, which it makes sense that they were there, but I can honestly say I wasn't that aware of that story. And I'm just, where is that in the process of being revealed and the healing and as across the U.S.?
It's been funny to work on this story, as I'm First Nations, but I live and work in the United States and I do journalism in both countries. It felt like in May of 2021 when that New York Times, notification came out about the potential unmarked graves at the Kamloops residential school, It felt like it was an opportunity for the U.S., or at least the U.S. media took it as an opportunity to go, oh my God, look at what Canada did, which is, profoundly ironic and a little bit ignorant, because of course there were nearly 3 times as many, Native American boarding schools in the United States as there were Indian residential schools in Canada. There were hundreds of thousands of more students that were taken to those schools. And there is no parallel reckoning yet happening in the United States in the way that there is in Canada. And also, the American system was in many ways the basis for the Canadian one. One of the very first institutions of this kind was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, which was created by Brigadier General Richard Henry Pratt, who first tried out his sort of assimilationist methods on prisoners of war from the Indian Wars in Florida, and then created a school that was, in his words, designed to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man, which was essentially the same intention of the schools in Canada. And in the United States, the government actually arguably maybe has more culpability, because unlike in Canada, where the schools were run by the churches, in the United States, the schools were often run by the government itself. So there's actually just now a proposal for a Truth and Healing Commission that's part of a bill that's moving through the Senate. Our film is actually going to screen in the Senate this September, and is part of that broader conversation and effort. And there's also been a series of reports commissioned by the first ever Native American Cabinet Secretary, Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, whose Interior Department has been leading an inquiry, a federal inquiry into Native American boarding schools. So this is a history that is just now starting to be part of a conversation, a national conversation in the United States. And we are very lucky that our film has come out at a time when we can be part of that effort of breaking open this history and this conversation.
That's a very hopeful point moving forward. Then it sounds like. And aside too, I also listened to the Cooper Island podcast by Duncan McHugh, which was also an incredible bit of reporting on residential school off the BC coast. And there's a character who shows up in that, Glenn Dowdy, brother Glenn Dowdy, who was an abusive priest who got jailed, who also shows up in your documentary. I was like, I know that name, and I went and Googled it, and I'm like, oh my, it's the same guy. And which goes back to the whole point about just there was a system of pedophiles who were just being moved around in these schools right across the country. Yeah,
it certainly appears, if you look across the patterns of not just our own reporting, but multiple others, that appears to have been a policy, whether it was written down or not. We would need all the records to be able to know that. But listen, part of my family happens to be Irish Catholic, and it's just kind of hard not to look across the history of the Catholic Church. And this does not just, pertain to residential schools. It pertains to, the Catholic Church's abuses in Boston and in France, in Ireland, and not see that there was, a pattern of pedophilia, of abuse of children, and then a pattern of, moving around the perpetrators of that abuse as a way to, avoid accountability. Because, of course, before there was, firstly, back in that day, it probably would have been very hard to get any, newspaper or journalist to take, an allegation against a priest, against the church, seriously. And secondly, there was no internet back then. So, all it really took to avoid any sort of community sense of responsibility was to move, Father such and such or brother so and so from one place to another. And how would they possibly know, what this priest had done, what this brother had done in the prior place that they were. And so, it seems pretty clear, if you're following the story, that this is what happened. And, if you read, as we have, some of these correspondences and documents and other archival notes and things from these schools, there are obtuse reflections on and commentaries about the fact that this was happening. There's one letter in our documentary where the writer refers to a priest being a pest to the children's morals. Which I don't know. What do you think they were talking about?
Seems pretty obvious. Yeah. Yeah, and this is absolutely, as you've said, this is really a documentary about the impacts of intergenerational trauma. And your dad at the start, I think, says it just keeps on damaging. It keeps on going, which, it's, and I'm just, do you feel like with documentaries like this, like with the other reporting that goes on, with the healing that's happening, that we're at a point where the healing can really start now?
I think that's the hope, of course, and certainly the case for my dad and myself and our family has been that we luckily have had the opportunity to heal from this history. My dad had the opportunity to ask his mom some questions that have always been, nagging at his soul. And, I had the opportunity to not just have some conversations with my father, but also to live with my father for a couple years and to take an unforgettable road trip back home to the Res and also to the mission where he was born. I think that the point of all of that is not just, about the people who are in the documentary, all of whom, have been really fortunate to come from a community and place that's ready to have this conversation, that really wants to heal, which is, I think perhaps the role of our nation and our people. Of course, the discovery at Kamloops was, from another part of the Secwepemc Nation. This is actually the neighboring school. So in a lot of ways, our people are at the forefront of this conversation. And, we are encouraging others across Indian country, across Canada, as well as the United States, and perhaps in other places with similar policies and histories, to have the courage to also have these conversations. I think there have been so many instances of us screening the film where somebody stands up afterwards or comes up to us afterwards and says, I saw so much of myself in this film. I saw so much of my father and your father. I saw so much of my grandparents and your kia. And the point is for those people to finally have the courage to ask those members of their family about what they endured, and also, for those members of their family to have the space to talk about it, to finally say, this is what I endured, or this is why I still struggle to put words to my experience. And, I think that we've just now started to see that happening. And, it has been the honor of my lifetime to play a small role in that movement, because, I think that when we look at what these institutions did, it's hard to see anywhere in Indian country that was not deeply, deeply scarred by this history, where this history did not ripple across generations of families and communities. And, the first way to start getting around that, to move forward, is to be able to start putting words to it, to be able to start speaking the truth.
Yeah. I always think about that Thompson Highway quote, the poison has to be exposed for the healing to begin, or I'm probably not getting that exactly right.
Yeah, another incredible storyteller from our region as well.
Well, thank you. And I would also, I know this is sort of rolling out in theaters now, and I saw it on a smaller screen, but I would love to see it on a big screen because it is absolutely beautifully shot. And Williams Lake and that territory around there is.
Yeah, I think that was another piece. I mean, there's so many pieces of this that we could talk about, but it's hard for words sometimes to do, a film justice because it's so visual and sensory. Yeah. But, Emily and Chris Lamarca, our director of photography, did exceptional work on this documentary, in many ways. And one of them was they really captured the power of the Caribou and the broader region of British Columbia that my people come from on camera in a way that really, I think makes the land and the place itself, because of course the film is called Sugarcane, which is the name of the res and the community, itself a character. You see it as, in a way, parallel to the people. Here is this incredibly majestic, powerful landscape that in many places has also been, scarred and maimed by histories of extraction, by, more recently, very terrifying wildfires, one of which nearly burned down the Sugarcane Indian Reserve just, 7 years ago or so. And, that is a part of this story as well. And it's one that is very close to us as First Peoples, as Indigenous peoples, because, of course, to be Indigenous is to be rooted in and connected to the place that you come from. And, I just am really grateful to my team and also to our editors to really understanding that and, representing that in every single shot and edit in the film.
Beautiful. And you mentioned just in passing too that you as well as doing this documentary, you're writing a book, and I think that's coming out soon. Do you want to tell us about that?
Absolutely. So I am actually right now editing my first book. It's called We Survived the Night. It will be published by Knopf in North America, I think part of Penguin Random House in Canada. It will also be published in the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, in France, as well as Germany. It's a combination of memoir, of family history, and reporting, but it's all told in the style and structure of a big coyote story. So my people, we account for the world and its creation through narratives about this trickster figure who Creator sent to the earth to set things into order. And of course, he was a trickster, so Coyote messed a lot of things up, which is why things are a bit messed up. We also consider him a bit of a first ancestor, and so there's a lot of the trickster in us, and I see a lot of the trickster in my father and his father, in myself, and in the way that the world works and really is. And so I use those stories and the ideas and themes running through them, as well as their like actual narrative structure, to tell this big story about myself and the Indian world and the stories that I see, running through it and across it. And I'm really excited about it. I think it's ambitious, and it comes out next fall if I stay on my horse here and finish these edits.
Yep, keep editing. Well, that sounds amazing, and I will look forward to getting my hands on that. And I just want to say thank you again for this documentary, which is I absolutely encourage everyone to see, and for coming on to talk with us about it.
Kukshem, David, and it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you, of course, on CanGeo's podcast and platform. It's an honor to be on the masthead there and to get every once in a while one of my stories in print.
And thanks to all of you for listening. If you or your family has been impacted by residential schools and you require emotional support, there is a 24-hour residential school crisis line in Canada, which you can reach by calling 1-866-925-4419. Until next time, when we'll explore again, I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people
We
about
left Simpson about June 10th with the Fur Brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
We flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 160 dives or so. There are shrimp, fish swimming around outside. It's just fabulous here.
Well, I'm a first for Canada.